was a professor at Harvard. That was terrific. Hello.
Alan Funt.
That show was the biggest thing on television. I mean, it was the first morning show.
Our website, where all of this appears, is newsgeezers.com. I know you've all been there. Strangely enough, we wind up getting about 7 to 1,000 hits a month, and 5% of those come from China. What can I tell you? I have no idea. I'm always hoping, to be perfectly blunt, that we can get from one of these lunches to the next without one of us dying. And when I started this, after we had about 30 people on board, somebody said to me, "This isn't working out very well, you're going to have a problem." And I said, "What's that?" And they said, "People are going to die." And I said, "Yes, they are, and I can do nothing about that, and I can do nothing about taxes. The only thing, we're all a family here. We've all worked together at one time or another. We're all professional friends and informal colleagues, thanks to this group. And when somebody passes away, we make it known. We pass out obits. We provide funeral arrangements if there are any. And at the following lunch, we give an opportunity for people to speak about the person that they knew. Bob Flick had come to at least one of these luncheons. I believe it was last July. So we're about to hear some great stories about one of the greatest of all television news producers, Bob Flick. He was a veteran of City News, and let me know if I leave anybody out here, KNXT in the big news era, NBC Local and Network, and later on, ET. Many of you know he was the producer when NBC correspondent Don Harris and cameraman Bob Brown and San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson were murdered covering Congressman Leo Ryan's trip to the People's Temple compound. Still hard to talk about that all these years later. Jonestown, Indiana, that was in November of 1978. Bob survived, but was forever changed about what he witnessed, and so would the rest of us have been. After his long, illustrious career, Bob was retired and was 84 years old when he slipped and fell and hit his head on New Year's Eve, age 84, and succumbed to his injuries. Even if we didn't know him personally, and I never had the good fortune to work with him, we all knew of him, and his loss comes as a great shock. I'd like to bring up a succession of people here who can talk about him. I have a list of 4 or 5, and if there's anybody else, I'll certainly call for you on the end. I hope I haven't neglected anybody. I'd like to start with the person who probably knew him professionally longer than anyone in the room, and that's Pete Noyes.
Bob Flick goes back a long ways with me. In 1958, late 1958, I was working as a night editor at City News Service in the old Cotton Exchange building in downtown Los Angeles, where rats eventually ran over the teletype machine. It was a wonderful experience. I was the night editor, I was the teletype operator, and I was the police reporter. So one night, a young guy, tall, handsome guy named Flick, walks into the city room and says, I'd like to help you out. I'd like to learn something about the business. I said, "You're going to be crazy." He said, No. So I said, "Okay, come in every night for 5 weeks and we'll go through an internship. Maybe you'll land a job on the Times." Well, about 2 weeks later, our police reporter, Bill Burke, quit. And I told our managing editor, Chuck Riley, we got to get somebody on the police beat who will intimidate the syndicate. The syndicate were the reporters for the metropolitan papers who boycotted City News Service, wouldn't have anything to do with us. In fact, they set up a phony story about Mickey Cohen being killed in Griffith Park, and our police reporter, the first woman ever to go to the police beat, reported this story, which went on the air all over Los Angeles, and she was fired. and City News did a retraction. So anyway, Flick, working with him, it surprised me. The obituary writer at the time said, I didn't know they let you hire people who didn't have a college degree. I never thought of that. I didn't think a college degree was that important. I still don't think it's that important. So I said to Bob, he had started writing little stories, short stories for me at night. People getting killed in traffic accidents, robberies, all the drivel that goes on in the metropolitan area at night. And he was pretty good. And one night I left him alone while I went out to dinner, and he kind of teed me off. He wrote a story in Shakespearean English, like, Ode to a Drunken Driver. So anyway, I blew my top at him, and I said, you asshole, don't you ever do anything like that again. And I'm driving home at night, and Charlie Arlington of KFWB is reading Ode to a Drunken Driver on KFWB. So I said, maybe this kid is smarter than I am. So he went over to the police beat, and my God, it was war. It was war. There was one horrific story. He annoyed Dick Odeski, the obnoxious Herald Examiner reporter, no end. He just drove Odeski crazy because Odeski claimed he parked his car too close to Flick in the parking lot. And he complained to the chief of police. Well, the cops didn't like Odeski either. And that's part of the story. So Flick went to work. He came out for his dinner break in his car. The steering wheel was out of the car, and the car tires all had been removed, and the car was on blocks. And there was a note in the car saying, "This will teach you, asshole, not to park too close to my car again." So everybody was gathered around waiting for Flick to kill Odeski. Flick walked back into the press room and said, "Don't bother to annoy me again." Sat down at his desk and started reporting on the day's events. The cops, they had a theft detail which had taken the steering wheel out and flattened the tires, went out and set up his car. And Dick Odeski had no idea what was going on until the other reporters told him. Flick was a calm man under fire. He was a calm man under fire. So anyway, he had a couple of years at City News under his belt. Became an excellent reporter. And we brought him in to work city side. And then he was hired away by United Press, and he had to go to Arizona to work. So Flick made it by way of Arizona, and from Arizona he bounced back to Hollywood. And in the meantime, I went to work at CBS. And a couple of years later, who joined me but Bob Flick? Bob Flick was considered one of the top writer-producers in the newsroom. Excellent talent. So there came a job opening in Orange County. And Flick really wanted the job as a reporter, producer in Orange County. But Grant Holcomb, he was a news director. You know, they're all idiots. I'm getting to that part of the story. So anyway, Holcomb hired a guy named Jim Cooper, a retired Marine Corps colonel who was probably the worst reporter I've ever seen in Los Angeles. Flick could take it no longer and went to work at NBC. Meantime, your village idiot here was a news director in San Diego where they fired me after 12 months. I'm out in the street. I have a house payment. I don't have any money because they didn't pay me anything in San Diego. And I'm at home and the phone rings and it's Bob Flick. Get your ass up here to Burbank. We need you. I said, what do I do? He says, the news director is a squirrely guy named Erwin Safchek. But he says he takes instructions from me. So I travel up to Burbank, and I go and see Safchick. Very punctual. The meeting was at 9:30, and I was there. Safchick says, "You're Noyes, huh? When do you want to start work?" I said, "Tomorrow." He says, "No, wait till next Monday." So I said, "Okay." He said, we discussed salary. He said, "Well, $35,000 be okay?" God, I was taken aback. "Yes, sir." So that's how I wound up at NBC. Thanks to Bob Flick, who probably saved me from suicide or some other form of self-destruction. And Flick was really one of the best men I've ever known in the business. You know, a genuine respect and love for Bob Flick. Is one of the real people in news. He's gone, but Bob, you're not forgotten. And we salute you here today at the Geezer's Luncheon.
Could I call for a standing ovation for Pete Noyes?
Following Pete Noyes, how do you do that? Thanks a lot, Bob. And I'm delighted to be here because this is one of the few times I'm not the oldest person in the room. I write out my stuff because I can't ad-lib like Pete. Runs 4:59, so I'm still to keep it under 5 minutes. You cut 30 seconds. Those of you who didn't know Flick in the 1960s missed Flick in his prime. He had a wicked sense of humor. He was one of the funniest men I've ever met. Another news writer, Mike Gavin, was one of his best friends. Those days at KNXT when Flick and Gavin would hold court were rare and wonderful experiences, and the memories are still with me. I know I will never see the like of those two again. It pains me more than I can say. Most of you know this classic Flick story, but I've been asked to repeat it. One day, Flick overheard TV anchor Jerry Dunphy telling the news director that all of the news writers were unnecessary. He could do the show all by himself. He didn't need any of those damned writers. The next evening, when I came in to write my share of the stories for the 11 o'clock report produced by Flick, he told me and the other news writers to go sit down and leave him alone. When Dunphy came in for the script at 10 p.m. for the 11 o'clock newscast, he was told there was no script, since news writers weren't needed. By 10:45 p.m., Dunphy was in a panic and called the news director, Grant Holcomb, at home, who immediately called Flick. Flick told him not to worry about it and hung up. At 10:59, he went to the news set and had the script fed to Dunphy, one page at a time with no teleprompter. We in the newsroom watched the broadcast, not believing what we were seeing. The exact second that Dunphy got to the end of one page, Flick fed him the next page. Dunphy somehow fumbled throughout the whole broadcast. At the end of the broadcast, Dunphy, white-faced, came in demanding that Flick be fired. Flick told him to go fuck himself. How he got away with this, I don't know. That ended the matter, and from that day on, Dunphy did whatever Flick told him. If anybody in the newsroom had tried that, they would have been fired on the spot. I've got one more Flick Dunphy story that some of you may remember. The CBS management thought it would be a good idea to send Dunphy to Vietnam so they could advertise our man in Vietnam. They sent Dunphy with a producer because Dunphy was probably a great newsreader, but one of the worst reporters I've ever seen. So they sent him with a producer to produce the pieces so he could do the stand-up and say, "Behind me is the war," or something like that. Holcomb got up the courage to order Flick to run the pieces that appeared on the big news intact on the 11 o'clock report. Flick was furious because the pieces ran about 5 minutes and he thought they were crap. But he ran the first two. Then there was no word from either Dunphy or the producer. Notes appeared all over the newsroom. If Jerry Dunphy calls, immediately contact Grant Holcomb. A couple of days passed, still no word from Dunphy. So we were listening to 11 o'clock report, and Cleet Roberts, who was substituting for Dunphy, came on the air and said, "This is Cleet Roberts substituting for Jerry Dunphy, who is lost somewhere in Vietnam." The phone immediately started ringing, and it was Holcomb. He wanted to know how we had heard that Dunphy was missing. I said, I didn't know anything about it. He kept trying to call Flick during the broadcast, but Flick wouldn't take his calls. Finally, Flick came back to the newsroom, and the phone rang. I told him it was Holcomb, and he took the call. He held the phone in the air so we could all hear Holcomb screaming at him. Occasionally, he would bring the phone to his mouth and say, "Yeah," and then hold it away from his ear. Finally, he said, "Thanks, Grant," and hung up. The next day, Dunphy reported in to say he was coming home. Flick had obviously made the whole thing up. After Jonestown, Pete mentioned that, but after Jonestown, Flick was never his old self again. He never forgave himself for surviving when his colleagues were being shot down. We had lunch, and I couldn't believe how bad he looked. He was a shadow of the Flick I knew. In fact, I had to go to the restroom because my eyes were filling with tears, and I had to compose myself. I didn't want him to see me upset. He asked me what he should do since he couldn't bring himself to work in hard news again. It was too much for him. I told him that Paramount had called me because it was putting together an entertainment news show and wanted to hire some real journalists to do it. I told him it could be the perfect job for him because he would simply come in, write the entertainment newscast, and then go home. And I added it would be at least $2,000 a week. He said he was interested. I gave him the contact information, called up and told him that Flick might be interested, and he would be the best guy they could ever get. And 2 days later, Bob called to say he took the job as head news writer for Entertainment Tonight. We agreed it might be perfect, maybe for 4 or 5 months, maybe a year. And he, as you know, he stayed there about 17 years. 2 years later, this shows you what a great friend he was. I needed some money because I had 2 kids at Yale. I called him and asked if there were some part-time, flexible hours work that I could do since I was still full-time at USC and wasn't going to give that up. He said he would get back to me. 10 minutes later, Jim Bellows called and offered me a job. When I arrived at ET, Flick saw me, came over and gave me a gigantic bear hug. It was a sign that Flick approved of me, and that gave me instant credibility at ET. It was that kind of gesture that made Flick such a loyal friend, such a great friend. Flicker was a hero of mine, and I'm running out of heroes. Norman Corwin, who lived to be over 100, once told me that the worst thing about getting old is that you lose most of your friends. And every time a friend dies, a piece of your history dies too. When Flick died, he just didn't take a piece of my history. He also took a piece of my heart. R.I.P. Flicker.
You know, Joe, I think there's a theme that we can see here is that Flick really did care and protect his friends. When I went to ET, the show was about 6 months in, and nobody still quite understood what the hell entertainment news was, certainly not me. And Flick was very protective of me, and the most important thing we had to do that day, each day, was find out what the hard news story was to open the newscast. And when the Paramount executives called the morning Charlie Bluedhorn died and said that was the hard news story, that the guy who owned Gulf and Western, an auto distribution parts company in the Midwest, and had enough money to buy Paramount, and that was the head story of the day, Jim Bellows and Bob and I looked at each other and we all said no. And Bob was extremely supportive of that decision. There's a hearsay story. I don't know if anybody can corroborate it, but I've always thought it was fabulous because Bob at one point at NBC would write the news break-ins for the NBC Nightly News when Brokaw was the newsreader on those break-ins. And Brokaw and Flick never got along. So at the last minute, Flick would give him the copy, and he would put in as many L's as he possibly could in all of the copy Can anybody corroborate that? There you go. I didn't want to let that story go lost, you know. So one morning, Bob and I were always the first to get in. And one morning, I'll never forget it. I got in exceptionally early that day. Bob was already there. It was about 5:15, and I was in my office looking over the trades and probably 2 or 3 other papers looking for our head story. And Bob walked in, sat down, and said, "I want to tell you about Guyana." No one had ever heard him talk about this before. Something about that day, I don't know what it was, he opened up and he told me about the event. Tears in his eyes, tears in my eyes, told me how he, at the very moment of all of the slaughter, was able to crawl over and find himself near the nose wheel of the plane and protect himself from the slaughter. And it was perhaps one of the most riveting stories I've ever been told, and it was one that I'll never forget. But I have to end on a flickism, because he could destroy you in 4 words. So one morning, Ron Hendren, who was a lovely man, and you know, Ron's ability to give any story that was sort of half newsy, the sense that this was the most important news event of the day, and that was kind of why we had him at Entertainment Tonight. But one morning, Ron came in brandishing a new pair of armadillo cowboy boots. And he walked over to Flick and said, "So, Bob, what do you think of my new armadillo boots?" Within a split second, Flick said, "You know, I think they looked a hell of a lot better on the armadillo." He was a wonderful man. We certainly were all shocked by the news. And yes, I think he was a protector of many of us, and we're all here to say thank you. Thanks, Bob.
I think one of the other themes that runs through this is that Bob Flick had a total disregard for people in authority. And I think that was amply illustrated when Bill Small took over as the president of NBC News around the end of '79, early '80. So sorry. So sorry. So Small had this reputation of being this kind of stuffed shirt from CBS, who was going to, you know, who thought we were a bunch of losers and was going to remake the NBC News division. So Art Lord, who was the bureau chief out here in Burbank at the time, said to everybody, "You know, you guys might want to dress up just a little bit for Mr. Small's visit." So Flick complied with that. He showed up in a tux. And Mr. Small was not amused. He told Art, "This guy is damaged goods." Well, of course he was damaged goods. They'd sent him to Guyana. I mean, how idiotic is that? The first impression I had of Flick's disregard for authority was, I was working at Channel 4 one weekend in 1970, and Flick was in the San Francisco bureau, and it was an extremely slow news day. Nothing was happening, you know. And the producer of the 6 o'clock was desperate for something to fill the void, and they dispatched Flick to cover an anti-war demonstration in San Francisco. Well, it was raining in San Francisco, and there were only about 8 demonstrators there, parading around, and they were kind of huddled in their rain jackets, parading around. Flick calls the desk and says, "It's no story here. 8 demonstrators, the rain, this thing is a dud. We ought to ding the story." Desk said, "Oh, we're desperate, Bob. You got to do the story. We don't care how few demonstrators there are. Just give us a minute and a half of something." So Flick turned in the story, He had the 8 demonstrators parading around in the rain. He had a soundbite with a guy saying, we're going to be here rain or shine, no matter how few of us there are. And then he does a little stand-up close in which he said, the demonstrators are vowing to keep this up. If this stops the war in Vietnam, we'll get back to you later in the program. And I will always remember that very fondly, as I remember Bob fondly. His wife Shirley didn't want to have a memorial service, so I guess this is sort of in lieu of that. And thank you all very much.
Warren Cereghino.
Bob and I worked together for about 8 or 9 years at NBC. And there's this thread that's been running through all of this about his intellect and his size. I summarize as that he was a giant of a man and he had a wit and intellect to match. His no respecter of authority number that I remember best, other than the Bill Small tuxedo number, which was priceless, because I ran into him that day. He was down on our floor, and I said, "Why are you wearing a tux?" And he told me this story about, and he said that Small asked him, why are you doing that? And he said, "I wanted to impress you." so that's true. So. Those of you who remember when J. Edgar Hoover was director of the FBI and he died, and the Nixon administration was trying to figure out what the hell to do with the FBI now that Hoover was gone, and they fumbled through several acting directors and ended up with Clarence Kelly, the former chief of police in Kansas City, Missouri, being named the permanent head of the FBI. Well, the FBI had been smarting for a number of years under the criticism from the media that it wasn't very responsive to the public's need to know. And Kelly said that he was going to have a new policy of openness with the FBI and the media. And a few days later, he was in San Francisco, and Flick and the crew from the San Francisco KNBC Bureau caught up with him at the airport, and there ensued one of the funniest interviews I've ever seen, because Flick kept asking him, "What is it you're going to do to make it easier for us to talk to the FBI?" "Well, I can't talk about that." And Flick would keep prodding him, and Kelly kept saying, "No, no comment," And I don't remember his stand-up close, but it was just a disaster, and it was hilarious, and we put it on the air that day because it was priceless. One other thing that's memorable is that Pete, I have to say that I think it was Las Vegas, Nevada, where Flick did the UPI bureau chief, rather than Arizona. But in Phoenix, and then he moved him up? Okay. Well, this story was told to me by John Flynn, who was another longtime NBC News guy in Burbank, and prior to that was CBS News in Saigon. And I told George and his wife this story after John's funeral. John told me one time that he was the AP bureau, and there was only one person in the bureau in Las Vegas, and that Flick was the UPI bureau in Las Vegas. And again, you have to be old enough and have to have been around at the time when we read wire copy off paper that was printed by teletype machine, because otherwise you won't know what the hell I'm talking about. Because you would read what was transmitted on the wires whenever they had line trouble, one form or another. You'd get a lot of garble on the copy, and then they would say, "We've got wire trouble, we're working on it, blah, blah, blah." So Flynn was, Mr. Fastidious. He was always buttoned down. He was, both of them were supposed to hit their respective bureaus at 7 o'clock in the morning. They were crammed into, as often was the case with smaller municipalities where the AP and UPI bureaus were centrally located in the local major metropolitan paper. In this instance, the two of them were side by side in a cubicle. So, it was that small. It wasn't like Phoenix, at least, where the UPI bureau was here and the AP bureau was back here. So, anyway, Flynn said that he would be there every morning at 7 o'clock, and every once in a while, Flick would kind of stagger in about 7:30 or 7:45, and already having missed his first statewide split on the wire, with nothing going out, he would sit down and he would crank out garble, and then he would and then he would intersperse line trouble, we assignment editors oftentimes times found it difficult to deal with Bob at a minimum, but I had a way of working with him. Those of you who, again, were around in the 70s remember that there was a period of time when every Friday somebody was hijacking a PSA airliner up and down the system. And the really bad one was the one where the FBI agents shot out the tires of the plane on the tarmac at SFO, and that's when they stormed the plane and that actor was killed in the shootout. Anyway, it was raining up there. Friday afternoon, Bob lived in Marin County. He had already slogged his way across the Golden Gate Bridge to go home. The wires started banging out all of the bulletins on this, so I called him, I got him at home, and I said, Bob, there's another skyjacking at PSA, SFO. Yeah? And the FBI shot out the tires of the airplane. Yeah? And it's a bad situation. Yeah? Well, what? Go cover it, Bob. All right. And so he did. He got the crew together, and they went back down there and did the work. But he was, my most recent contact with him was just last summer. Mike Gavin was mentioned here. Mike Gavin also worked with us at KNBC. Mike Gavin had gone to my high school in Redwood City. Mike Gavin had done a piece on his class 20 years after they graduated, and we were trying to find that for the Alumni Association archives and couldn't. But Bob was very helpful on that. It was the last time I talked to him, and we had 3 or 4 conversations, very brief. But he was just a great guy, and he was as wickedly sharp as everybody here who has preceded me to this microphone has said. He was really witty, he was really funny, and he was a crackerjack reporter.
I beat the storm and got here. I live in Westport, Connecticut. But I wanted to say these things about my beloved Bob, if I can get through it, because he was a good pal. And I went on to become I was a field producer for KNBC, initially assignments, editor, trainer, intern, something with Warren. Then I was a field producer for the network upstairs, and went on to become a correspondent in New York and London. But Burbank remains huge in my heart to this moment. And I looked this entire job as from the eyes of a very young person, because I was in mid-20-something, 25, whatever I was. And my own children are that age now, and so I'm really trying to remember the times, and they were quite different. We had much more of a break getting into the business than is currently possible. But I did it because so many people helped me there. And one of them was Bob Flick. And in this network story, we were only a couple of field producers. He was the veteran. And I thought, from my 25-year-old point of view, or 6 or 7, whatever it was, that you grew up and you simply covered cults. Do you remember? That's all we did. We chased Patty Hearst, the Scientologists, the Manson group, Squeaky Fromme tried to kill the president, the Moonies, deprogrammers, and finally the awful People's Temple story. And we just constantly got assigned to these things. I was on this special unit with beloved Don Oliver as well, who I remember with such fondness. And a couple of others. We went up to San Francisco. We stayed weeks, months, 2 months maybe. And we worked on Crazy Jim Jones because he was pulling chicken parts out of hats and curing people in some black church, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. And we finally found people who had genuine stories about him, who would meet us in our secret hotel office, and we would videotape their stories, and we realized that something nefarious was really going on in Guyana. When we heard that Leon Ryan wanted to go, there was no question that we were going to come and cover that story in the situation that we knew about and already had people taped about, so it would all go together. And I went running back to Burbank, and I said to Don Dunkel, we've also lost my beloved Don Dunkel friend, I have to go to Guyana. And he said, I said, is it true we're going to go cover it? He said, yes, and he said, but I'm not sending you. And I said, why not? I've been on this special unit for a month. He said, because you're a girl, and I'm sending Flick. That sexist decision saved me from who knows what. Certainly a lifetime of PTSD, which Bob suffered. I do not know him. I did not know him well afterward. I hadn't seen him in a long time. But one day, I don't know, I am friends, by the way, with Shirley Harris Oliver, who married Don Oliver after she lost Don Harris. And she lives in Montana, and I'm an email pal. Very dear and very sharp lady still. And one night, I was in a hotel, as we all lived in nothing but, I don't know, 6 weeks or 2 months after that Guyana tragedy. And I was terribly aware of Bob being home and without us and without anybody. He was just lost. And with a bottle of wine and hotel stationery, I just wrote to him and told him how sorry we were that we couldn't help them and about the losses that everybody endured on that story. It was huge to us. We could all barely get through it. As I expected, I never expected to hear from him, and I didn't. But years later, somehow, either by phone, letter, or in person, and honestly, I cannot remember that. All I remember is that he said to me that he still had my letter. It meant the world to me. Thank you.
30 seconds worth. He was our Northern California bureau chief when he got rolled out in the middle of the night to cover a nuclear sub that had sunk at the pier at Mare Island. He got there with the crew, and there was little or nothing to be seen of this sub, which was underwater. And he got out there and sent back a stand-up railing against Phil Clappick on the desk for sending him out on a nothing story in the middle of the night, and wouldn't believe that it would come back. And that was his report on the sub sunk at the, at the Vallejo, at Mare Island shipyard in Vallejo. The last time I saw Bob was was at lunch with his back to the mirrors over there, and I was sitting next to him, and didn't have the pleasure or privilege of talking to him after that, but I was amazed at I did not pick up the PTSD. I did not pick up the resentment or the anger or anything he was displaying, nothing of that with me at that lunch in this room, but good feelings for someone he hadn't talked to for a long time. So my last memory of Bob Flick was very congenial, very up, and a good time, and I just fully expected to see him again, and unfortunately I didn't.
Mike, thank you. Steve Lentz.
Hello. I've certainly gotten a good I did not know Bob Flick, so what am I doing here? Well, I've gotten a sense of him now, but in 1978, I worked at Cron, San Francisco, and I did spend several days outside the People's Temple, which was on Geary Street, trying to talk to relatives of people who didn't know anything about what their relatives, whether they were alive or dead. So in 1979, the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences in San Francisco decided to give Emmy Awards to Bob Flick and to each of the people who were killed. I was sent to cover the story. So Bob Flick got up and basically just picked up the Emmy and said thanks or something and walked off. So I went up to see if I could get a soundbite for that night. And I asked him basically about how difficult this must be. And his first words were, "Get fucked." All right. But then he said to me, getting an award for something where your friends have been killed is utterly ridiculous. That was my one-line soundbite, and that was the end of that. Now, I will say, a cameraman from Cron who went down to Jonestown, he went down on an American military flight when they were going to go investigate this. His name is Joe Brennis. They flew in on a helicopter, and all the bodies were there. He said it looked like a patchwork quilt. And after he was on the ground and did that story and came back, he was never the same person. So I can't understand how much of an effect that had. So thank you very much.
two very quick Bob Flick stories. I worked with him at KNBC, and then he went to work for the network, and they sent him to Vietnam. And he was there, I don't know, for maybe 2 months or something, and all of a sudden, one day, Bob shows up at KNBC at the local assignment desk. We said, Bob, what are you doing here? You're working for the network. You're in Vietnam. And he said, yeah. And every day, Liz Trotta sitting there in the network and in the bureau, and I don't know who the other one was, but they sent me out to the front line to go and dodge bullets and do reports. I got tired of it, and he hopped. Nobody knew where he was. He hopped a military jet and wound up coming back. The other story, they mentioned Mike Gavin. He and Mike Gavin both worked in Las Vegas, and after one night of fairly serious drinking, Mike Gavin had one of those Volvos that looked like a 1947 Ford with the rounded edge. He said that he and Flick, for some reason, decided it would be fun to get up on top of the Volvo and jump up and down on it. Well, Flick was about, I don't know, 6'4", 6'5", 6'3", and a good size. And Gavin was no small guy himself. Anyway, Gavin says that after that, the only way he could drive the car was like this. I'll just second all the comments about Bob, that his personality and his warmth and his just acerbic wit was every much as big as he was, and I'm glad to have known him.
There is an organization that I plug every time that I'm here because I'm the treasurer of it, and Pete Noyes is the vice chairman, and that is the 8-Ball Welfare Foundation, which has been around since the mid-'50s and offers financial aid to journalists in temporary financial need. Some of you in this room have given substantial amounts of money to help the 8-Ball Foundation, and I thank you. There are people that you may know who have attended this lunch that have been beneficiaries of grants. And for all of that reason, I'd ask you to take a look at 8-Ball Foundation, number 8, foundation, 8-Ball, number 8, ballfoundation.com. If you know of somebody who could use our help, or if you would like to donate, all the information is there. Thank you for that. Next lunch is Saturday, April 23rd, and the ones after that I have yet to firm up with the folks back here, but it'll be the end of July and the end of October, as we avoid the Christmas period. For each of you that are here, know you have my personal thanks for attending. We've kept this going longer than I ever thought we would. I hope we keep it going for a lot longer. It's wonderful to see you all. God bless you all. Thanks for being here. Best wishes.